Thanksgiving was always a family holiday, which we celebrated at Aunt Anne's old house on the outskirts. The house was huge, creaky and a little scary, especially in winter. This year everything seemed especially strange, gray, foggy weather and a feeling that something was wrong. When I arrived, I immediately felt that the house was cold. Uncle John said that the heating was fine, but the air was unbearably cold. We started to cook dinner, trying to warm up in each other's company, and someone noticed that this time we had much more food than usual. But everything seemed normal until evening came. We gathered around the big wooden table in the dining room, when suddenly we heard a knock on the back door. My younger cousin Lily asked curiously who it could be, because we were not expecting company. But when Aunt Anne went to look, she came back white as a sheet. "There's no one there," she said in a quiet voice. We laughed and suggested that it might have been just a branch hitting the glass, but the knock came again. And this time we all clearly heard voices, muffled, like a whisper from behind the door. Someone said, "Open up, we're here for dinner." We froze, looking at each other. Aunt Anne looked scared and asked everyone not to come to the back door. She told us that many years ago, a tragedy had occurred in this house on Thanksgiving. The family that lived there had disappeared without a trace. And since then rumors of ghosts had haunted the place. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out, and the dining room was plunged into darkness. We heard quiet footsteps down the hall, approaching the dining room. I felt the air become even colder, as if death itself had entered the room. In the dim light from the phone I had turned on in the dark, I saw Aunt Anne swaying by the door. She stared into space, whispering, "I won't let you in." Then I heard someone knock on the door again and say in a low, strangled voice, "We're family too, open the door." Fear filled the room and no one dared move. We stood there, unsure of what to do, when Aunt Anne finally spoke. "They come back every year." At first I thought it was a joke, but every year they become more insistent. "Never open the door, no matter who it is." Her words sounded like an order, not a request. Every year. A chill ran down my spine. I knew old houses could creak, especially at night, but these sounds weren't just creaks. They were footsteps outside the door, and sometimes right behind us. Even though we knew there was no one behind us, suddenly there was a scraping sound behind the door, as if someone was scraping nails on wood, trying to get in. Then a quiet, barely audible voice whispered again. "We want a holiday too, don't forget us." It sounded like an echo from a deep abyss filled with suffering. My cousin Lily began to cry quietly, and we all looked at Auntie Anne, hoping that she would know what to do. Auntie Anne took out an old, slightly yellowed candle and lit it. She told us to sit in a circle and hold hands. She said that her grandmother had once taught her a ritual that could scare away unwanted guests. We began to whisper the words that she spoke softly, but their meaning remained a mystery to us. With each word, the scratching and whispering behind the door seemed to fade. But when we were almost finished, someone, or something, called loudly from behind the door, "Anne. You promised." The voice was cold and full of pain, and Aunt Anne trembled as if someone had opened all her dark. Suddenly everything was silent. The whispering, the knocking, the scratching disappeared. We were left alone in the silence. The next morning, when the sun was shining on the house, we finally decided to open the back door. On the threshold lay an old, dusty photograph that I had never seen before. It showed a young aunt and surrounded by people I did not know. At the bottom was written, "The family you were not supposed to forget." Every year we would gather at my parents' house for Thanksgiving. My mother always decorated the house, set the table, and cooked incredible food. That year, everything was especially important because it was our first holiday without my father. He died in early fall, leaving a huge void in our family. I knew it would be hard for my mother to organize everything on her own, so I decided to arrive early to help her. When I arrived, the house seemed empty and dark. At first, I thought she might have gone out or forgotten about our meeting, but the door was open and the light in the kitchen was on. As I entered the kitchen, I noticed something strange. There were a lot of old dishes on the table that I had never seen before. Each place had a name written on it in crooked handwriting. My plate was in its place, but there seemed to be other guests waiting at the table besides me, guests I did not know. Looking closely at the names, I saw the name of my late father and other relatives who had been gone for many years. I looked around for my mother when I suddenly heard something rustling at the entrance. I turned and saw my mother at the door. Her face was pale and she seemed not to recognize me. She calmly walked up to the table, picked up one of the old plates and began to put food on the empty plates, as if she was serving dinner to invisible guests. "Mom, what are you doing?" She slowly looked up and looked at me with a strange, bleary smile. "We're all having dinner together tonight, like always," she whispered softly. I tried to understand what was happening, but I felt a strange, heavy silence, as if the air in the room had become thick and oppressive. And then I saw something that made me freeze. A barely distinguishable, but familiar silhouette appeared on the other side of the table. It was my father. He was sitting in his usual place, but his eyes were empty and his face was grim. Soon he was joined by other dead relatives. I recognized them all. "Bu." I tried to get up and leave, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My head was ringing and my vision was blurry. The last thing I remember was a cold touch on my shoulder and a quiet whisper, "You too." The next morning, the neighbors found me sitting at an empty table in an empty house. Mom was gone. Is this really how it is when you lose someone close to you and you can lose your mind? On Thanksgiving Day 2012, I decided to spend it in solitude on an old family farm that had long since been abandoned. We had a tradition of family gatherings, but that year I felt the need for solitude and reflection. The farm was on the edge of the woods, away from the noise of the city. The sun was slowly setting over the horizon as I began to cook dinner. I chose my favorite simple meal: turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound coming from the basement, like someone was moving something. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was repeated, and my heart began to beat faster. I approached the basement and, standing on the top step, saw that the door was slightly open. I had a thought that someone might have gotten into the house, although I knew that no one had lived there for a long time. I took a flashlight and went down. I was surrounded by darkness and the sound seemed to be getting louder, as if someone was whispering my name. The basement was full of old things, boxes, furniture, and dusty objects left over from when the farm was in its heyday. I looked around carefully and noticed that one of the boxes was upside down. As I got closer, I saw something strange, an old doll with a cracked face. I remembered that my grandmother always said that this doll was cursed. At that moment, I felt a cold wind blow through me. And suddenly the light of the flashlight went out. I reached for the batteries, but in the darkness I heard the same whispers that seemed to be coming from the depths of the basement. I was scared and decided to run out, but I tripped and fell. When I got up, I noticed that the doll was closer than before. I ran out of the basement, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were confused. I decided I wouldn't stay there a minute longer. The next morning I packed up my things and left, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. After I left the farm, I had a hard time focusing on anything. I went back to town, but the feeling that someone was watching me never left me. I often had nightmares about the doll at night, its cold eyes always looking at me warningly. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt its presence, as if it was waiting for the moment to appear again. A few months later, on the eve of the next Thanksgiving, I decided it was time to finally get to the bottom of this. I began researching the history of the farm and came across old records about my family. One of the records caught my attention. In the late 1920s, a woman named Alice lived on this farm, who was known for her strange hobbies. She was said to have collected dolls, and one of them was particularly mysterious. Legend had it that the doll was made from the hair of a missing girl, and Alice always carried it with her, even when she died under mysterious circumstances. The more I learned, the clearer it became that this doll was more than just a soulless object. I felt like I needed to go back to the farm and try to understand what was going on. Finally, on the same day I had once escaped, I found myself in front of the same gate again. The farm looked just as abandoned as it had been. I took my camera, notebook, and of course, a flashlight. As I walked up the steps to the front door, I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything inside was in the same state: dust, cobwebs, and silence, broken only by the sound of my breathing. I headed to the basement, feeling like I needed to find that doll. The light from the flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and I noticed again that the basement door was slightly open. As I approached it, I remembered the whispers I had heard. I went down and, to my horror, saw that the doll was again lying in the same place where I had left it. It seemed almost alive, as if it had been waiting for my return. I felt fear growing, but curiosity also pushed me forward. I came closer, and at that moment the doll suddenly moved, as if it had come to life. I could not hold back a scream and, closing my eyes, stepped back abruptly. When I opened them again, the doll was gone, leaving behind only a slight scent of flowers that Alice had once loved. I rushed back to the stairs, but this time the basement did not seem empty. Shadows began to appear in the corners, and, having climbed the steps, I saw how the doors closed behind me with a dull slam. I found myself locked in this eerie place. I knew I couldn't stay here. I screamed, but my voice only echoed off the walls. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the same whisper I'd heard before. This time, it was louder and clearer. "Help me!" I froze, realizing that the doll and Alice were somehow connected, and I was part of this story. Not knowing what to do, I continued to search for a way out, hoping that I could leave this place before the darkness swallowed me whole.